Welcome to History at Age 9, a program about naval history from the Hampton Roads Naval Museum in Norfolk, Virginia, home of the U.S. Atlantic Fleet. The fleet continued their journey steaming across the Pacific toward Hawaii. The 3rd Division, commanded by Rear Admiral William H. Emery, broke from the rest of the fleet and headed southeast toward the island of Maui for coaling. A small party had the honor of meeting the former Queen of Hawaii, Queen Liliuokalani, at her home in Lahaina. Even though the Queen had been deposed and exiled by the U.S. government in 1893, she was still gracious enough to greet the sailors. The rest of the fleet arrived in Honolulu on July 16th. The sailors were given liberty and had a very nice time. Their 6-day stop consisted of luau's, sailing regattas, and plenty of beach time. Liberty was only a small part of a sailor's life. What was the rest of their life like? I'm Katherine Renfrew, and this is Voyage of a Lifetime, The Great White Fleet, 1907 to 1909, Episode 3, Across the Pacific. Early century sailors lived a life that was rugged and frequently dangerous, a life that was transformed even more by the new technologies of the ships on which they served, and hardships of weather and the ocean. Accidents were not at all uncommon, and the sailors basically existed in a physically claustrophobic world. They endured these hardships and enjoyed brief moments of fun whenever possible. The normal day-to-day tasks kept sailors busy while underway. Non-stop rounds of cleaning, chores, watches, and drills were the norm. Let's take a look at some facts of the sailors of the early 20th century. Sailors still slept in hammocks. Sailors still holystoned, or you can call it swabbed the decks. Provisions and messing arrangements changed due to ship refrigeration, which resulted in a general mess instead of a rotating mess. The Navy rations law in 1902 passed, making the food on ship more palpable. Ratings changed as the skills needed evolved. Organized sports and a system of ship libraries were established. Frequent stops for coaling were part of everyday life, whereas before on a sailing ship, as long as you had potable water and your food held out, the ship could remain at sea. Life at sea for the sailors who worked above deck did not have it so bad though, compared to the jobs of the coal passers, who worked in the fire room below decks. At a minimum, the sailors' topside had the advantage of sunlight and breezes. Below decks, the engineer's world was dominated by intense heat and coal dust. One sailor, Charles Herget, commented that after working with the coal, he decided that hell can't be any worse than this. All was not bad though. After hours, there was still time for other diversions for those not on watch. Aboard the ships were pianos and phonographs, various games, plenty of playing cards, and handball and billiard equipment. There were also silent movies. One sailor on USS Connecticut said they had one movie they showed us about 50 times. It was called The Perils of Pauline. It was a film series. They might show number 9 one day and then show number 47 the next, but we enjoyed it anyway. She, meaning Pauline, was always in some kind of fix, getting thrown off cliff and things like that. The extracurricular activities enjoyed by the sailors was definitely earned. After Hawaii, the fleet then streamed to New Zealand, arriving on August the 9th. Once again, the men were warmly received by the civilians as they entered Auckland's port. The men were entertained with party after party. The New Zealanders even invited Admiral Sperry and his staff to observe the tribal ceremonies at a Maori village. The next stop was Australia. When they arrived in Sydney on August the 20th, they were greeted by more than 250,000 people who had supposedly stayed up all night so as not to miss the ships when they arrived. The Australians welcomed the fleet with great acclaim and cheer. The fleet made stops in Sydney, Melbourne, and Albany. Nothing was too good for the sailors. They were given the key to the city of Melbourne, and their kindness made such a good impression that many sailors were disinclined to leave when the ships got underway. In fact, the U.S. Navy men were very popular with the local females, and many relationships bloomed during their visit. This created an issue so much that USS Kansas stayed behind to round up latecomers after the rest of the fleet had sailed off to its next destination. Even that wasn't sufficient to bring in everybody. More than 100 of the Americans deserted and stayed behind with their newfound companions. The fleet steamed north, headed for the Philippines. They arrived on October the 2nd. The Liberty was not allowed due to a cholera epidemic. However, a few officers were allowed on land, but they could not stay overnight and had to bring their own drinking water and not eat any of the food. On October the 10th, the fleet departed for Japan. Now, while en route in the South China Sea, they ran into a severe typhoon. Now, a typhoon is a tropical cyclone that occurs in the South Pacific or Indian Ocean, and it was reported that this typhoon was the worst in 40 years. According to one sailor, the typhoon happened right off Formosa. All you could see when a ship was in trough was the trunk of its mast above the wave tops. That was all you could see of an entire battleship. Then our turn would come to go into a trough, and we couldn't see anything for a while. The storm lasted almost 2 days. Finally, on October 13th, the storm subsided. Admiral Sperry gathered the scattered ships and assessed the damage. USS Kearsarge lost its foremast and wireless antenna. Wisconsin, Illinois, New Jersey, and Virginia had their whaleboats smashed and washed away. The Virginia also suffered flooding from her destroyed ventilator. Railings were twisted and broken, portholes shattered, and wireless aerials destroyed. Apparently, the fleet was fairly lucky. The storm killed some 800 people in northern Luzon in the Philippines and wiped out an estimated 2,700 people in Amoy, China. The fleet recovered and headed toward Japan, the most crucial visit in terms of diplomacy. But before reaching Yokohama on October 18th, Admiral Perry distributed a directive concerning liberty in Japan. In it, he stated, only first-class men whose records showed no evidence of previous indulgence in intoxicating liquor would be allowed ashore. The directive went on to state that the men will be made to understand that this, though an entertainment, is a matter of military duty, and all sailors should conduct themselves accordingly. When the ships arrived the next day, they were escorted into the bay by 3 Japanese destroyers. On shore, they were greeted by singing school children that had been taught to sing the Star-Spangled Banner, Hail Columbia, and other patriotic American songs. Monday, October 19th, was declared American Day in Tokyo. The government and people of Tokyo and Yokohama had been preparing for the fleet's visit for months and went to extreme lengths to ensure the visit went well. All the citizens had hung Japanese and American flags, lanterns, and other decorations on their houses. During the visit, no incidents occurred. The fleet's visit had the desired result. It generated goodwill between both countries and eased tensions that might otherwise have led to open conflict. Admiral Sperry reported to President Roosevelt that it had been profoundly successful and beneficent in effect. President Roosevelt was delighted. My policy of constant friendliness and courtesy toward Japan, he wrote, coupled with sending the fleet around the world, has borne good results. In fact, on November 30th, 1908, the Root-Takagi Agreement was signed. It was an accord between the U.S. and Japan that averted a move toward possible war. It mutually acknowledged certain international policies and spheres of influence in the Pacific, and pledged mutual support and respect for the open door policy in China. Leaving Japan, half the fleet steamed back to Manila for a target practice, while the other 8 ships set course for the Formosa Straits and the Chinese island of Amoy. The Peking government was prepared to welcome 16 battleships, but when only 8 ships arrived, the local officials were very disappointed and embarrassed. The slight was due to operational requirements and unintentional on the fleet's part, but it created a slight issue where the Chinese believed they had lost face. However, Peking saved face by reporting in the Chinese Imperial Court newspaper that the rest of the fleet was lost in a typhoon, which was a believable lie at the time. Similar to the Philippines, a dangerous epidemic plagued Amoy. In order to keep the sailors safe, China had built a special entertainment center or temporary city for the officers and men of the Atlantic Fleet. It had to be rebuilt after being destroyed by the typhoon. All of the food and drink was brought in from Shanghai, along with rickshaws, mandarin chairs, horses, and wagons. The American fleet honored the Dowager Empress of the country. She reciprocated by giving presents of cloisonné china to the ship's crews. Each officer received a vase, and each enlisted man got a teacup. Many of the sailors were introduced to shark fin soup, an Asian delicacy, and they also witnessed the horrific beheading of a Chinese citizen. Concluding its call on Amoy, the 8 ships steamed back to Manila to join the rest of the fleet on maneuvers. On December 1st, 1908, the entire fleet departed the Philippines and headed toward home.